And sorry, here we are a bit late, of course, and so we're getting back slowly.
Thank you, Eric. It's perfect. It's perfect. So welcome to the second session of the Why Property Conference. I am really pleased by the two talks we already have this morning. Thank you to everybody to be with us, and especially to the speakers, of course. So I'm really pleased to introduce Francis Cheneval, who's professor at the University of Zurich. His talk is about natural assets, property rights, and custodial duties. So you have 25 minutes for your talk, and then we will have about 20 minutes for discussion. Thank you to be here with us. So I give you the floor, Francis.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Is that the case? Can you hear me?
Perfect. It's perfect.
Okay, and you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Sorry for sending in the paper late. Sorry for not tuning in earlier this morning because I had teaching obligations, but I'm very happy to join in, and I heard a little bit of the last conversation, and I think what I have to present can be in a very good, interesting conversation with previous talks. So this I have reduced my presentation a little bit on the creationist, conservationist account of property, which is the normative or socio-ontological normative core of my paper, and then I spell out the implications for the global common goods and global public goods that follow as implications of this property theory. Later on in the paper that I didn't send in, it would have been too much, and also that part is not quite so sufficiently elaborated yet. So what I'm talking about now in this presentation is this core of my property theory. So I start with the very basics of property. I think property or ownership, I use that interchangeably, is a relation between a person and a thing. And property as a relation type grounds property rights of the person to the thing. Owning grounds property claims and obligations, like promising grounds promissory obligations and claims, or moral personhood grounds moral obligations and claims. So it's in the nature of owning. If X owns something, that X has then property rights to this thing. We could talk more about grounding, but I think it's non-causal. It's cancer is not grounded by smoking. Smoking might cause cancer, but property grounds property rights, just as promises ground promissory rights. Property rights are absolute rights in rems, to start with, pro tanto. What do I mean by that? I specified it in the paper to be as precise as possible. I think property rights, they do not have an opposing party, unlike promissory claims and obligations. They do not have a correlative obligation that is identical in content. They do not have to be realized towards somebody. The property right in the thing does not have to be realized towards somebody, and they can be exercised by the right holder. So this is a very narrow and precise definition of why property rights are absolute rights and are to be distinguished from such rights that are grounded in promises, which are always based on a social act towards another. Property rights are not moral rights, I say in the paper, because they're not grounded in moral personhood. I do not own my toothbrush in virtue of being a moral person, but I have moral rights in virtue of being a moral person, such as rights to not to be enslaved, etc. So there needs to be some property constitutive act performed in order to establish the relation of property. Like there needs to be a promissory act in order to establish the obligations and claims that follow from a promise. So I think it's very important to see that property rights are not moral rights. And so a property right is not a right that gives me some sort of power to alter moral rights of others. the Property Constitutive Act does not establish or alter moral rights. And so property is usually, I think, morally or normatively overstated by being considered directly a moral right. And I go through this in the paper. I'm not going to go into further details about this. Then I go through some implications in the paper of this kind of approaching property and property rights. I think, first of all, what is said about the nature of property and property rights holds equally, or is not dependent on whether the property right holder is an individual, a group, a collectivity, the state, or even mankind. The pro tanto right to use a thing as it pleases also means that the owner has a pro tanto responsibility. The owner is responsible for anything that happens between the owner and X being owned. Property can never be a person-to-person relation because it annuls sort of it annuls moral rights on the side of the thing that is being owned. Something needs to be reified in order to be owned. Property is not based on usefulness. It's not usefulness that constitutes the relation of property, and it's not uselessness that unmakes the relation of property. It's important with regard to emissions. If you just want to ditch something because it's not useful to you, if you are in the relation of property with it, you don't unmake that relation just by ditching it because it's useless. On the other hand, it's not usefulness that eo ipso constitutes the relation of property. And also, I think the right to transfer is usually mentioned as one of the core property rights. I think it's not the case if you look at property from this angle, because the right to transfer is based on a social act that is an agreement between an owner and an addressee of the transfer, and both have to agree, actually. So pro tanto, there's nothing in the property right that just gives you the right to transfer, gives you the right to negotiate transfers, but in order the transfer cannot take place unless there is agreement on both sides. And if there is no agreement on both sides, you are stuck with your property. And if you just ditch it anyway, you cause an emission or a negative externality. Possession in itself does not ground property rights. And I go through this in the paper as well. Acts of forceful possession are not acts that ground property rights. You can show this in different ways. So it's not the use of force or the forceful occupation of something that is actually the property constitutive act. And then I say nature is not to be considered a person that gives things to people. So, for instance, the planet to mankind, and then mankind is the common collective owner of the planet. Or Adam owns his arm because it was given to him by nature. I think rights over bodily parts are personal rights. One has them in virtue of being, and so the property rights again are not rights that you have just in virtue of being a person. So the rights to things that are external to one's body are not given to us by nature, because nature is not a person that transfer things to people. I'll come back to that because, of course, in Locke there's a theological dimension to this. So I come to the question: what are then the property constitutive acts, or what is this theory of original entitlement? And I go through the usual suspects, and I sort of also, I don't have to explain this to this group. I think there are many reasons why first occupancy is in a way not plausible as a constitutive act of property. I go a little bit into the Lockean labor theory or productive labor theory, and I also go through a certain amount of arguments in the paper why I think it's not plausible. And I come to the creationist account, which is not discussed so much. It's sort of been neglected, I think, very much neglected in the literature that's always sort of focused on Locke. But there is an interesting it's more than a variation of the Lockean theory. I think it's a creationist account that you find in Reinach, a philosopher who died very young of the 20th century, a Jewish philosopher from Germany. And so P3 holds the relational property between A and A exists because A has created X out of something, that was previously unowned. So the formulation of Reinach goes. And I think this creationist account is quite plausible in one respect. It's plausible to claim that the creator has a relation of property with something that would not exist without the creator, and that has the creator sort of as a sufficient cause. The act of creation implies that the possibility of a choice of the creator to not create the thing or to modify it as he or she pleases. And so it's quite plausible to say the act of creation is actually the property-constitutive act. And it's also plausible to think that vis-a-vis the created thing, the creator has a pro tanto right in rem, an absolute pro tanto right in rem. Should say absolute here on the and not total, an absolute pro tanto right in rem. And I think this is especially plausible as a theory for intellectual property of intangible things that someone creates out of non-rivalrous goods. If you write a paper, you create a symphony, you invent a formula, you write a poem, etc. You have a special relation to that thing, this intellectual object you create, or this intangible object that you create, the computer program, etc. So I think in that realm, the theory is quite convincing, also for organizational things, etc. Anything you can put an intellectual property stamp on. But I think the creationist account has a problem that, of course, it's related to problems that the Lockean account faces. But it cannot solve the problem in the same way as Locke tries to solve it. Because regarding rivalrous goods, especially rivalrous natural goods, inorganic or organic or mixed in ecological, in ecosystems, I call them here Y, A's act of creation is creative destruction. So A creates X and destroys Y. A creates a guitar, maybe, a violin, and destroys a tree, for instance, and so forth. So if you look at this from that point of view, P3 cannot account for A's right to destroy Y in case A does not create or cannot create Y. And it's true that the creator of the guitar is not the creator of the wood, of the tree, etc. And so the question is, to what is P3 then committed regarding Y here? Y as the group of things that are used but not created in the act of creation. And I think it's quite clear that P3 cannot consistently commit to the position that the relation of non-ownership that A has with Y grounds A's pro tanto right to destroy Y. And the right to destroy Y would be actually the most, radical form of a property right in rem. And in case it does commit to that kind of a relationship, it would ground property rights in non-property, or in the abscess. It would ground property with the absence of a property-constitutive act. So I think that's quite inconsistent. So P3 cannot commit to that. And of course, you can say, okay, there's maybe a moral right to destroy the apple by eating it, but that would then be reducible to a moral right to subsistence, but not give any further rights to destroy trees in order to, make just statues that we want to have in our garden for aesthetic purposes, etc. So anything that goes beyond subsistence and livelihood would not be covered would only be covered by the moral rights, but not be covered by this property right. And so the moral, to bring in the moral right here is I don't think it would solve the problem. Of course, Locke would say something like God has given natural assets to mankind. So there's an act of transfer at the origin of this claim here in a Lockean theory, but that's a theological assumption that you can make if you want to be a theologian, but not as a philosopher. Right? I think it's an assumption. If this thesis is to be internally consistent as a philosophical theory, it wouldn't just bring in Deus ex machina here and say, okay, well, the planet is ours because God has given us the planet. Fine, but it's not a philosophical thesis. So I think the conservationist element comes in here in order to solve this conundrum. So I think we need P4. We need a fourth sort of formulation here. And I put it this way here. A constitutes relation of property to X if and only if A creates X out of intangible, non-rivalrous goods, or replaces, renews, or recycles the intangible goods Y out of which X is created. And so there, I think this avoids the commitment to a right that is identical in content with a property right over uncreated, unowned goods, while grounding property rights in property-constitutive acts of creation. And so I think this formulation avoids this commitment, and it also avoids bringing in a theological assumption of the tree is at my disposition to destroy because God has given me the tree in the first place. And of course, the normative consequence here is that there's, strictly speaking, no property rights of material things without conservationist duties towards those things. And I think this applies to individuals and groups of property holders. So no matter if we're talking about the collectivity of mankind claiming the planet, or some state claiming natural resources, or some individual claiming property of a forest, I think that's then, of course, to be sorted out. How do we organize the division of labor of conservationism? That's a cura posterior, as I would say. But I think this condition here that is being this P4 formulation, it applies equally to individual, private, or collective public property holders, property owners, and of course, maybe to stop here and see where this takes us in the discussion. So positive legal enactments of duties of stewardship and circular economy, so to speak, in that sense, are justified, I think, by P4. So they're not an infringement on property rights, because we have to understand these property rights, I think, quite differently from the traditional Lockean account. I would even go so far as to say they are a necessary part of a philosophical theory of property. And so then what I do in the paper, in the second part, is I spell out, on the basis of this property theory, I spell out certain conditions of property, of dealing with the global commons, such as the atmosphere, and global public goods such as climate stability or biodiversity. And that's the part you didn't get from the paper, but I think you can maybe see where this is going. The normative discussion takes me a little bit into, of course, the conditionalities that individual or collective property owners need to fulfill in order to rightfully claim property, always with these two things in mind. So I think there's an individual right to create and to establish property, and then there is an individual or collective duty to conservationism. And there's of course also the teamwork of creation of things, and so teams and groups and collectives become the rightful owners of the things they create collectively or as a team. And I go a little bit into that in the paper as well. So I'll stop here. I think I'm within my time. I thank you for your attention and give back to Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk, which develops somehow a realistic theory of property articulated with conservation duties, which can be compared, for instance, to contractualist or utilitarian or republican approaches like Taiwan defense. So I think the discussion will be very interesting. I give the floor to the audience. Eric, can you give the floor to the participants who are in presence at Nuffield and perhaps manage the discussion due to the atypical situation? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Ingredients, Taiwan? Yes. Okay. So, Taiwan, then Michelle. Go on, Taiwan.
Yes. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. And my question is on the, I mean, you build up your conclusion based on the idea that when A creates X, at the same time, A has to destroy Y. My question is like, that statement going to be true only if we perceive X and Y in terms of the natural resources? I mean, in terms of resources, for example, we need to cut a tree in order to use it to build something. But if we consider X and Y in terms of the welfare or the utilities that a person could get, it seems like there is going to be no trade-off between X and Y. Like we cut a tree to build a house. That means we increase the utilities of a person. A didn't destroy anything. It's just like no trade-off between X and Y, just like increase the value of it. What do you think about that? I'm sorry if that makes sense.
Thanks for the question. I hope I understand it correctly. So I think there is always a possibility of creating X out of non-rivalrous goods, so that there are no trade-offs involved, huh? And in that case, there is no conservationist duty that kicks in. But then the idea of just upgrading something, if I understand you correctly, did you mean that we upgrade a thing so we don't destroy, but we upgrade it from wood to a guitar or to a violin or something like that? Is that the point? Because if you build a house, you destroy natural habitat. Huh? You destroy the CO2 absorption capacity of wild land, etc. You destroy many things when you build a house. And so, of course, you create value, you create shelter, you create something positive. That's not denied. But I think you have to account for the destructive side as well. And that would be the point then. You have to account for that by fulfilling some sort of circular or conservationist or stewardship duty. That would be the point. I hope that answers the question, if I understand it correctly.
Sorry, maybe I confused myself. Like, I mean, my argument is like, if you consider it from the viewpoint of welfare, when you cut the wood to build up a car, you didn't destroy anything. It's just the increase of the utilities that a person could get. So it seems like we cannot say that we destroy Y in order to create X. I mean, it's just like we start from Y and we make it to become a Y plus. So in this sense, it seems like there is no destroy of. I mean, there is no trade-off from the viewpoint of the utilities.
But that would imply that any creation of value for a human being sort of justifies any kind of destruction of value, because you do actually destroy the tree. Factually, you do. Realistically, you destroy the tree. I don't deny that you create utility for human beings and that you have a certain property claim that you can base on that. But I would say that property claim is only consistent if the destructive part of your act is also accounted for.
Okay. Thanks, Michel.
Thank you very much, Francis, for this talk. you said so the creationist account is especially plausible in the case of intellectual property. So I was wondering what would be the implication of this approach in the case of COVID vaccines. So I have the impression that the conclusion would be, since Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna, so to speak, created those vaccines, they are owned by these companies, and so they can sell them at a high price. But then there is also the approach that these vaccines represent global common goods that should be distributed to the whole global population. So does this creationist account can make room for this kind of global common goods or not? And I think this could also apply to climate change, for instance, in terms of green technologies such as windmill, solar panels. There's also a case to be made here to say that those represent global common goods because we need them at global level to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So what would be the implication of this account in those two cases?
I think what it implies is, and I think we can learn that something can be a common or a private good, and at the same time it can contribute to a public good, and that has to be accounted for as well. So I think, so one thing is just a strategic discussion of how do we assure the future financing of future vaccines, and I think we do that by giving intellectual property licenses to firms in order so they can refinance future research, and then that's the best effective way of assuring that in the future this public good will be produced. But you know, the fact that we have a public good that is a result of the vaccine shows that actually something that is private property can have public good effects. So. And then the question is, how do we guarantee the public good effect? That may be by reducing the private property, which is the case, by limiting the license agreement. And of course, there's no philosophical a priori argument I can give you why it should be 20 years or 10 years or 5 years or less. The point is the public good is a value that needs to be that has a normative, certainly a great normative weight. And then you take it from there. But I would say, you know, whoever creates a vaccine has pro tanto a property claim to it. Now, if you created it with state money, and that's, I think we have to see this here in the equation, that some of this research was financed by the public by the state actors, and that's why also then states claim a certain, you know, amount of vaccines. So there's a trade-off there, but even states claiming vaccines for themselves might also be a problem for the global public good of you know, creating the COVID crisis. So I think this public good, global public good dimension, normative dimension, it limits the private property rights of Pfizer, etc., to a certain extent, but also the state. The individual states' property rights to those vaccines if they hold back too many and thereby you know, avoid from the global public good of fighting the pandemic being provided. But I mean, your question shows that here is where this thing needs to be spelled out, and I thank you for that question, and I realize that my answer is here very short and of course very incomplete.
Thank you.
Okay, if I can just add one question before we switch to the online questions. It's very, I was just wondering because, well, in your account, so when we destroy X, there must be some kind of duty to replace X by some Y, or, you know, to have this kind of equivalent somehow. But the difficulty for me is that, well, in the example you gave with the tree and the guitar, it seems to be okay, quite intuitive. We can replant a tree in order to satisfy the duty to replace what we took somehow. But how do we do in the case of different things when we have an X and a Y which are incomparable, and especially in the case of X's where it is impossible to replace it in the short or in the middle term. I mean, I'm thinking to oil somehow, you know, what do we do if at some point well, how can we value the fact of taking, I don't know, 1 billion barrels of oil what would be the amount of other things that we should provide as an exchange value somehow? I don't know, it's just a thought like that, so I don't know if you have comments on that.
Yeah, I think, oil is, of course, a very crude sort of thing. What we usually have is oil that is extracted and treated very early on in the process. And my immediate response to this would be recycling. So of course you don't have to pump the oil back into the ground, the crude oil, but the idea would be anything you make from oil, you recycle it. So of course this also then reduces the amount of new oil you have to take out of the ground. But plastic being an oil product ought to be recycled, etc. So I think I would subsume this in the recycling condition. I was thinking also of examples like marble or stone that you used to make a statue. Now, Michelangelo, what does he do now? But I think there also is the idea of recycling, because for different reasons, it just makes sense that these raw natural assets, I don't think we just have a property claim to them, God-given. So what do we do? Well, if we dig into nature like that, and of course you also destroy cultivated land when you make marble mines, etc., or quarries. The idea, I think, the short answer is recycling.
Thanks. I think as a follow-up, just an interesting case would be, like very restricted, like lithium or some stones or minerals that are quite rare, and which we cannot replace in the middle term. That would be an interesting case to address. Well, recycling of lithium is possible, I think, but it's technically almost impossible to implement for the moment. So because it's disseminated in so many little batteries and stuff like that. That would be an interesting case maybe to also to address.
Yeah.
When recycling is not possible and we have a limited amount. But well, I think we can go to questions online. And Niklas Angeboer.
Yes, thank you very much for this very, very clear and, in my mind, very convincing argument that you presented. I just have a small question on the relation to Locke, because in Locke scholarship, of course, there's a huge debate on how to best make sense of him. And one of the crucial questions when it comes to the notion of property is mixing or making. And you presented the traditional picture of Locke presenting a mixing argument, mixing something with labor, and critiqued it. But so this is the reading of Simmons and Waldron and others. But of course, there's also the reading of, I don't know, James Tully and Richard Ashcraft and Gopal Srinivasan, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, who ascribe this creationist argument that you've made precisely to Locke. And I just wonder whether you, how you see Locke in that discussion. And a very, very quick second point, I think also this conservationist element that you mentioned is present in Locke. It's not developed. But if you look for example, in the essays on the law of nature, the very early ones, he says something like, all things are justly, sorry, I just lost my quote. All things are justly subject to that by which they have first been made, and also are constantly preserved. So it's not just the creation, but it's also the preservation which you have there. It doesn't really develop into a coherent theory in the second treatise, but still it is also present there, I would argue. So I'm wondering, like, how much you would want to connect this to this Lockean framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. So, my paper is not an exegetical paper on Locke, and I do think that we can read Locke in many, many different ways, but I think everything is there and maybe not so well worked out. So I find this creationist account in its most clear expression, I find it in Reinach. Now I agree with you. One can read Locke in the ways you have said, and in case Locke meant that, I would say he was right. But I'm not. My intention is not to make to pull Locke in one way or the other and say that's what he meant. So I think, and I thank you for those comments. And I think in the definite version of the paper, I have to give more credit to the creationist interpretation of Locke. And then in case it's a creationist interpretation of Locke, then Locke would just have to be moved. The problem is then what you do with everything that Locke says about mixing labor and about productive labor, etc. So I think that's why I think so. Just keep the systematic and the exegetical apart, and then you have a clarity of argument. But I thank you for that, and I think also the passages you quoted about preservation. I think Locke has an idea that nature renews itself, but I don't think he has he sort of formulates a conservationist or let's say a duty to recycle or replace. He even thinks, I can show you passages where he thinks if you don't cut down the forest and create factories and create economic value, things go to waste. And to just leave the wilderness wild is actually waste for Locke in some passages, again, maybe not others. And that's where it's very different from my argument. Bas van der Vossen has an interesting paper, a recent paper on the ecological dimension of Locke. Besides, I think I quoted in my paper, and I think you're right. In a definite version of my paper, in a future version, I will give more credit to the possibility of a creationist interpretation of Locke. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
So can I take the floor?
Yeah. Go on.
Thank you.
So go on.
Thank you. So thank you again for your talk. So I have two questions which are very close one from the other and are somehow contractualist objections. Would you say that property is a right or a thing? If it's a right, I think one must say that it is a relationship between persons in relation to a thing. To my point of view, a pure relationship between a person and a thing is a fact, not a right, and doesn't ground any obligation. So that is my first question. Do you think that property is a right or a thing? And the second question is the following. You defend that the obligation to respect the property of others is grounded on the previous existence of a property right. My question is how it is possible to ground an obligation, here the obligation to respect the property right of others, without any sort of previous contract or some kind of collective agreement about the legitimacy of this right.
Mm. Yes, thank you. So the first question, I think I think there's a way of conceptualizing property rights as absolute rights in rem. It's a right over my action towards the thing. And it's comparable to my absolute right of remaining silent, etc. And so in that sense, it's not a right that is established by a social act in the first place, because it's a relation. Property is a relation to the thing. And of course, if you bring in morality, immediately what you say is true. Then my property right is only pro tanto my right in the thing, and as soon as, let's say, my right to my apartment is then conflicts with your right to find shelter in my apartment, then your moral right to find shelter and be rescued trumps my property right immediately. So that seems to be, to me, without the question. But I don't think we need a prior, not even a prior contract about that, because you have the moral right in virtue of being a moral person to being rescued, and I have the property right in virtue of some property constitutive act to my apartment. And then we don't need to. Then the fact that I have to take you in is not conditioned on any kind of contract I have to make with you, or I have the freedom to make with you. I don't have that freedom, actually. If you have a right to find shelter in my apartment, you have that moral right, even without a contract. So I don't think that contractual dimension here is necessary, even to think the relation between, what my right of property means in relation to you as a moral person, for instance. And the second question. What was that again? I think it's
the same. Yes, it's the same. But
yeah.
My question is, do you think that we have a right to revolt against great inequalities? Another way to say it, do you think that we have the obligation to respect property when property grounds great inequalities?
On grounds of moral rights, certainly. If moral rights are being violated by the fact by certain amounts, but I think in and of itself, of course, the creationist account will not put any limit on what you create. If you are free to create, as a computer specialist, you create an ingenious computer program, and that might create a great inequality between you and me. And I don't think I can just rebel against you on the basis of that inequality. I would have to show and justify in what sense some moral right of mine has been violated, and I could maybe question what you do with that wealth, if you misuse it to engage in sort of political manipulation, etc. So there, I think also. But it's not the fact that you establish property by creating that I can contest if you are really the creator. But of course I can contest things that you might do with your wealth instrumentally. But then that's not the same thing as questioning property as such, or questioning your property right as such. And I think that's might be confused oftentimes. But it has, further down the road, there are many ways how we can put property rights in relation to moral rights and in relation to permissory rights, which are, I think, contractual rights in a way. You can say also constitutional rights or rights of, etc. are in a way permissory, right? They're grounded in promises. Constitutions are promises to the people, to each other, etc. And many restrictions can come from there, I think, or many, but not the fact that the pro tanto relation of property is questioned and the property right pro tanto.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can we give the floor to Jacob Blumenfeld? Jacob, you want to?
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, my camera is not working. Just a kind of a follow-up on that question, the grounding of the paper or the talk in the claims that property is amoral, a relation between persons and things, and grounded in creation. I think when you set up the kind of the basic axioms of property this way, which are all very contested, and maybe the arguments for these principles are in the paper, because I didn't really see the arguments for this, just kind of the assumptions. But when you set up property in this way, then of course, the conservation becomes a problem to be solved, because there's no moral or normative limits. But if you conceptualize property as more of a normative relation between persons, which requires certain or is based on certain norms of needs, or what is sustainability, which can allow for property to exist in the first place, then the question of conservation is not something to be added on at the end, but kind of implicit in the very norms that ground the relation between persons in the first place in their use of things. So I'm just wondering if, how you set up the problem of property, it already leads to conservation being something that is hard to fit. But why do you set up the problem of property in that way instead of including it from the beginning in the constitutive, understanding of what it means to relate to people concerning things?
Well, I think I don't think property. It's not about a moral relation between persons. That's already overstating the normative value we might need to attach to property. So I take it from an ontological point of view to begin in the beginning. What is property? It's a relation to a thing, and then I think the normative dimension comes in, and the conservationist dimension doesn't come in as an add-on. I think it comes in as part of what grounds property. So it comes in quite early on in the ontological construction of property. But I think the methodological discussion we might need to have, or conversation then, would be what's the relation between social ontology or ontology and normative reasoning and moral reasoning. I think it's quite obvious that property rights are not moral rights. I do not have property in virtue of being a moral person. I cannot claim property in virtue of my moral personhood. So I think if you look at the moral universe, or what we owe to each other as moral persons, very personal bodily property is part of it, but not much more. And maybe the fact that we have to concede to each other the right to bodily activity and to mental activity, and therefore also I think we have the right to being creative. And that's then where maybe there's the sort of a way back in from early on from normativity in my construction. But I was just trying to construe the property argument from its ontological basis, and I don't think it makes much sense to say, okay, there's an overarching normative goal, and then all ontological facts have to be submitted to that normative goal. I think I don't think it works that way. I think states of mind, states of being, ontological relations, ontological properties, etc., are in a theoretical realm that needs to be taken into account when we want to answer the question, what is property? Not what ought to be my right to use X on the basis of my moral rights. That's, of course, a very interesting and important question. But I cannot answer that question before I've answered what it means to own something, what it can reasonably mean to own something, as opposed to just possess it or to forcefully occupy it, etc., etc. So that's why I go back to this Reinachian. By the way, Reinach is the inventor of the I think performative speech act theory and social act theory. And I very much work on this basis. That's very true. That's how I see the basis of it. And I don't know if that's not clear in the paper. I hope it's in the paper, and I'm sure it can be made more clear. But I think this is spelled out in the paper, or it should be. At least that was my intention.
Thank you again, Francis. I think we can come to the conclusion of this very, very interesting conversation. I am now pleased to introduce Cain Shelley, who is a PhD student at the London School of Economics. His talk is about climate change and contemptuous ownership. So as for Francis, you have 25 minutes for your talk, and then we will have 20 minutes for the conversation. Thank you to be there with us. I give you the floor now.
Start PowerPoint.
You can just open it up.
Yeah.
Oh, you can
Cheat by doing this. There we go.
It's even make it easier.
Okay, just share that.
Oh yeah, how do I?
Just click on the up arrow.
Oh.
There. Yeah, just don't click the red one.
Sorry, for a second I thought that was the one you were pointing at. And I realised that. Am I clicking on the? Is that the right?
Yeah,
one?
that's good. There we go. Just choose screen one. Let me have a quick get it back. Should be good for the people watching. Okay, that's good. Just need to get the focus back.
Good. Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, I'm going to start. Yeah, so thanks a lot to Eric and Pierre for arranging the conference. So in my presentation, I'm trying to convince you of two claims today. So most of us are probably vaguely familiar with the idea of certain carbon major firms like Shell, BP, Saudi Aramco, and some of the activities they do. So I want to suggest that two of these activities in particular, fossil fuel extraction that they're undertaking, continued fossil fuel extraction, and also political lobbying they're undertaking. I want to argue that they constitute undue interferences and also fail to appropriately consider the basic interests of others. And because they constitute undue interferences and fail to appropriately consider others, I think that these actions constitute disrespectful or contemptuous treatment. So that's the claim about the activities of the carbon majors. And then there's also a second claim, which is that it's the ownership structure on which the carbon major activity is premised that is kind of a cause or the cause of these contemptuous acts. So it's the profit-seeking ownership structure that kind of provides these firms with the reasons to act in the ways they do. And thus, it's actually the profit-seeking ownership structure on which carbon major activity is premised that is itself kind of conveying or expressing contempt for others. So there's basically a first claim about the morally defective actions that carbon major firms are undertaking, and there's a second claim about a source or the source of those activities. So I start by just kind of recapping the basic sort of role that the carbon major firms are playing in the climate crisis. Then I talk about what I think is wrong with those two acts in particular, lobbying and extraction, why they might be contemptuous or disrespectful acts. And then finally, before concluding, I talk about the significance of this profit-seeking ownership structure in kind of generating those acts. So to begin with the role of the carbon majors in the crisis. So all of the kind of major carbon major firms like Shell, Petrobras, Total, they're continuing to engage in fossil fuel extraction, and they're also continuing, and they have historically been lobbying governments and the broader public. And basically both of these actions are playing a leading role, I would argue, in the prevention of the cessation of fossil fuel extraction that we need to see in order to protect the climate. So to just kind of recap quickly both over these, in terms of fossil fuel extraction, all of the major carbon major companies are continuing to invest in maintaining and even expanding their ability to extract more fossil fuels. So according to the think tank Carbon Tracker, for instance, the largest carbon major companies have approved an estimated $50 billion of investments between 2018 and 2019 that were not consistent with Paris Climate Accord goals.
So we probably already know that large amounts of existing reserves need to remain unburnt in order for us to meet the goals. But not only are carbon majors continuing to extract from existing reserves, they're also actively engaged in attempting to locate new ones. And this isn't like a secret. You just kind of look on the websites of Shell and BP, and they're kind of like basically proudly proclaiming how they're making these investments and they're continuing to find new reserves. It is true that most of the firms have upped their investments in clean energy, but most estimates agree that this only amounts to something like 1 or 2% of the total budgets of the major carbon firms at the moment. So as well as continuing to invest their profits in extracting fossil fuels, the carbon majors are also spending lots of money lobbying governments. So just to give one example, during the 2016 presidential campaign, the carbon majors spent around $100 million on campaign contributions. And they're also not, what's important to recognize here is they're not just lobbying governments, they're actually kind of lobbying the broader public as well. They're attempting to kind of manipulate public opinion. Historically, you know, they've been associated with funding pro-deregulation think tanks and even like what are called astroturf campaigns, which sow doubt about the veracity of the science. And then more recently, they have promoted kind of technological wonder fixes and continue to kind of mislead the public with advertising campaigns about the extent of progress that the firms have made on greening their activities. So the kind of basic claim in this introductory section is just that these carbon major firms, through their investments in extraction and lobbying, are playing a role in obstructing the cessation of fossil fuel extraction, and burning that we need to see to prevent further damage to the climate. So then the kind of question arises, how should we evaluate these acts? Why might they be wrong or undesirable activities? So my claim in this section of the paper is that these activities that I've just been talking about are kind of, in a sense, doubly wrong. So first and most obviously, both of these acts constitute what I would consider undue interference with the basic interests of others. So what I mean here is that it's widely recognized by climate scientists that, you know, the emissions of carbon warms the planet and leads to a whole series of undesirable outcomes, destabilizes ecosystems, sea level rises. We're all kind of familiar with the long list of effects. The claim here is basically that to continuing to act in the ways that the carbon majors are in light of this scientific consensus, it's constraining agents' abilities to do the things that most of us have good reason to want, such as move and settle where we'd like, or do what we'd like with the things that belong to us, and to meet our basic needs for physical and psychological security, nutrition, healthcare, education. Even at the extreme, climate change has been linked with conflict and civil war because of resource scarcity, so potentially even restricts our ability to kind of influence political affairs. So what's important here as well is that even the threatened presence of some of these interferences can be damaging to individuals. So if an individual has a kind of realistic perceived threat that their access to basic needs or rights might be removed, then this can be just as debilitating, or it can be substantially debilitating on a par with if the actual interference was made. So there's basically a whole series of ways in which the carbon majors are interfering with other agents' possession of the kind of space and opportunity to pursue their own ends and act in ways they have reasons to act. As well as interfering, I also think that the activities of continued extraction and continued lobbying constitute a failure of consideration on the part of the carbon majors. So by kind of continuing to act in the light of the scientific consensus, these firms are also kind of omitting important things that they ought not to omit from their decision-making processes. So it's to kind of act in those ways is to fail to consider the possible impacts of their actions on others, to not appropriately include ideas about the interests of others in their thought processes and decision-making processes. So it's true that the causal pathways linking the specific actions of each of the carbon majors with the specific threats that I'm talking about are relatively diffuse, but they can, I would argue, be like reasonably certain that some of the harms related to their actions ought to be factored in as real possibilities into their considerations, and that they're failing to do this. it's sometimes suggested that the firms kind of, this is a particularly cynical defense, but it's sometimes suggested the firms couldn't be aware of the harms caused by their emissions. I think maybe up to a point that was true, but since the kind of scientific consensus, at least since the 80s, that kind of ignorance just isn't really a plausible excuse. Any claim to kind of reasonable ignorance concerning the causes or consequences of climate change are now, I would say, like fully unreasonable. So what I think is important about failures of restraint and failures of consideration of the sort I'm discussing is that I think they're archetypal instances of disrespectful treatment. So there's quite a large literature on respect and what it is to respect persons and respect for persons. And these two ideas about certain acts of restraint and certain acts of consideration kind of keep coming up. So I'm basically grounding the wrong of the acts of the carbon majors in this idea of respect for persons. I think respect for persons is basically like the sort of bare minimum which individuals can demand from those with whom they interact. As Joel Feinberg says it, respectful treatment is the very least that's required of us, basically. Regardless of our pre-existing relations to others, we could almost always, and all of us can, demand respectful treatment from others. So I basically, the claim here is that I just do not think it's plausible to maintain that one could think that one was acting respectfully towards others if one didn't engage in certain acts of considering the likely impacts of one's actions on them and also kind of restraining oneself from certain kinds of invasive acts. And what's important about this duty of respect for persons is that the treatment it recommends is warranted in a particularly weighty sense. There's only really supposed to be a few situations in which one can kind of permissibly violate this duty of respect. So the fact that the carbon major firms might receive certain benefits from violating the duty, or even that society as a whole might receive some, or that it's likely to kind of inconvenience the people that are violating this duty, these are unlikely to be weighty enough reasons to justify violating the duty, I think. So that's basically the kind of first claim of the paper that I set out in the introduction. So there's certain key players in climate change politics, the carbon majors, and they're engaging in certain acts, extraction and lobbying, which constitute disrespectful or contemptuous. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. Contemptuous activities that wrong lots of other agents. So the second claim, and this is obviously the bit of the paper that links most clearly with the discussion that we've already had, is that I don't think we should just kind of stop isolating the wrong, the individual wrongs that BP or Shell might be undertaking when they engage in continued extraction or lobbying. Rather, what we should do is kind of try to pin the source, or at least part of the source, of these actions, these morally defective actions, on what I'm going to term the profit-seeking ownership structure on which the carbon majors activity is premised. So what I mean here is that it doesn't seem plausible that these acts are driven either by the particular personalities or wishes of the particular individuals that happen to run these firms, or that they're kind of incidental to the main acts that the firms consider themselves performing. Rather, on my account, these acts are systematically, reliably incentivized by the ownership structure on which the extraction is premised. So these activities and the way that the firms are undertaking them, these are the firms working as they're supposed to work, in a sense. These acts of interference and failure of consideration don't simply happen accidentally, but they're kind of purposeful. So I think that to kind of substantiate this claim, we need to look at the way in which the carbon majors are owned. And basically the claim here is that it's in order to preserve the sunk costs of private investors and ensure investor confidence that the private carbon majors are engaging in their activities, so Shell and BP and so on. So the use to which the assets of the carbon majors are put is determined by the way the company which owns them is itself owned. So the CEOs of those companies regard their primary goal as being the maximization of short-term share price. Shareholders have the goal of getting a decent return on their investment. And this means that managers are very sensitive to changes in the valuation of their companies. Those in control of the companies know that investors are impatient and expecting results, and they're liable to move their funds elsewhere. And in this way, the owners are kind of exerting pressure on the companies to provide a return and act in the ways that they are. And I think as well, this is another important point. I think that this profit-seeking ownership structure applies not in an identical way, but in a very similar way, just as much to the publicly owned carbon majors like Brazil's Petrobras or Norway's Stat Oil, as it does to the private carbon majors like ExxonMobil or Chevron. So the key distinction here is between, on my account, is between ownership structures which are solely profit oriented and those which pursue a more diverse set of goals. It is true that public ownership can allow firms to pursue a more diverse set of goals, but the publicly owned carbon majors are set up in such a way that they are also just narrowly pursuing this return on this profit orientation. Sometimes actually the publicly owned carbon majors, because they still have this profit-seeking ownership structure, they're actually even more voracious in pursuing kind of high-risk pools of carbon as the privately owned ones, because the firm kind of forms such a big part of the country's GDP. So in thinking about this issue, I was influenced by a paper by Wahid Hussein, and he talks about how institutions can kind of define a framework within which people think. It sets up a kind of series, institutions can set up a series of costs for certain course of action. They can kind of recommend others. So kind of influenced by this, I'm sort of saying that a profit-seeking ownership structure is a system of rules which basically reliably provides the carbon major firms with very weighty reasons to treat agents in disrespectful ways. So by kind of saying that it's reliable and systematic, I mean that this is different from just saying that there's one bad apple at the top or in the kind of decision-making room, but these acts are kind of reliably patterned and structural. So the claim here, and this is really the main, I'm sort of trying this idea out for the first time, so this is the main thing I'm really interested in hearing what you guys think about, but the claim here basically is that we can actually term this ownership structure itself on which the carbon major activity is premised as contemptuous. So it's actually the system of rules itself which kind of conveys or expresses disrespect for others, because it provides such weighty reasons for decision makers to act in the ways that they do. So I know it might seem like a slightly strange idea, the idea of a set of rules or an institution that expresses or conveys contempt. So I was trying to think of another example. And I was thinking about the institution of the police in the United States. And maybe you could say that that's an example of an institution, a set of kind of rules, formal and informal rules, norms that kind of expresses disrespect for people of color in the US. It's going to kind of reliably produce these outcomes and cause individuals within the institution to act in certain ways which are disrespectful. And then maybe you could actually say that the institutional rules themselves kind of convey or express disrespect. So that's the kind of idea I'm going for. It's a similar kind of idea, but attached to the profit-seeking ownership structure, which I think is the premise of is the kind of basis on which the carbon major firms are acting. So obviously the claim here is compatible with thinking that sometimes profit-seeking ownership structures can convey and express respect for people, right? So I don't want to kind of make this kind of large claim that as soon as there's a profit-seeking element in an institutional setup or rules, that this is going to kind of be the inevitable result. It's just that this is a kind of, I guess, a paradigmatic or an archetypal example where that isn't the case. So I'm going to kind of start to wrap up now, because I'm mostly just interested to hear what you have to say, but just to kind of recap the argument again. So there's the first claim about how carbon majors are acting in certain ways, and these interfere with and fail to consider the interests of others. And those acts then are disrespectful or contemptuous. And then I tried to argue that it's actually the profit-seeking ownership structure on which the activities are premised that is kind of causing these firms to act in that way. And that maybe actually it's this institutional setup which is contemptuous in and of itself. So just to kind of say a brief word in conclusion, about what I think the potential contribution of the paper might be. So I think that climate ethicists and people working on climate justice have tended to focus on the moral status of the impacts of climate change, like the costs and what might be wrong about climate change on the one hand, and then also the kind of desirability of certain actions that states or individuals might take to kind of remedy these harms. So, you know, there's a huge literature on luxury emissions versus subsistence emissions, duties about future generations. And then there's also a huge literature on the moral status of certain policies that states might undertake, like geoengineering or carbon taxes, and also things individuals might do, like only have one child or go vegan or something. But there's also this third set of questions about the agents operating within states and between states that are kind of causing playing a significant role in the climate crisis. And I don't think that those agents, like firms like the carbon majors and financial institutions, have received the attention that they deserve in the literature. And I think part of that is because the debate is often framed in terms of the responsibilities of states to other states or individuals to other individuals. So the kind of the upshot, I hope it's slightly vague, but the upshot is that this idea of an ownership structure which expresses or conveys contempt for others might kind of help to kind of fill this gap somewhat. And I think I just wanted to put up the picture that I started the presentation with again, just because one thing that's interesting is that despite this gap or oversight perhaps in the climate justice literature, the actual activists on the ground kind of fighting for change around climate change have been far more sensitive to the roles of certain collective agents like firms like the carbon majors and financial institutions. And maybe climate justice theorists should take a leaf out of the climate activist book in terms of thinking about systemic changes and the way that firms operate within states. So yeah, thanks. I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Cain, for your talk, which questions the economical problem of externalities on a moral ground through the concept of contemptuous acts. I have some questions, but before that, I give the floor to the audience. Like for Francis, Eric, can you give the floor to the participants who are in presence at the Nuffield? Please.
We are restoring the broad angle so you can also see the rising hands. Michel and then Jamie. So Michel?
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. I think it's making more and more sense to focus on non-state actors, especially given the very high level of political inertia to fight against climate change. And I think there is a very small but raising literature on that, and we can think especially about the responsibility of states, of firms, and also of cities. And in the case of carbon majors, there is a paper by Dale Jamieson who has written extensively on responsibility in the case of climate change. And I was wondering how you would qualify the responsibility of carbon majors. So there are I think two major ways to qualify this. It's either forward-looking or backward-looking or positive and negative. And in his paper, Dale Jamieson says, since it's so complicated to link emissions of carbon majors with actual climate impact, going with the backward-looking responsibility framework is too problematic. So it's best to go with a forward-looking conception of responsibility, essentially with ability to pay principles. Since carbon majors are so rich, they have so much money, they can contribute very actively to the fight against climate change. I was wondering if you agree with that, or if you would keep some level of backward-looking responsibility. And on the other topic, positive or negative responsibility, what kind of duty do those carbon majors have, do you think? Is it only a negative duty to stop those two activities you talked about, fossil fuel extraction and political lobbying? So is this the only thing, or do they also have a positive duty to compensate for the harms to which they have contributed? And if you believe they have a positive duty as well, that would imply that you also have a kind of backward-looking responsibility conception.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sympathetic to some of the literature. Like I know there's also like a Henry Shue paper where he talks about these responsibilities of the carbon major firms. And, you know, personally, I have quite a kind of strong view that, yeah, it's backward looking and forward looking and have these negative and positive responsibilities. I guess one of the things I wanted to draw attention to in the paper, and yeah, I appreciate like having the opportunity to frame it in this way, because I didn't frame it this way in the presentation, but one of the things I wanted to kind of draw attention to in the paper is that climate ethicists can kind of sit there all day and discuss these kind of extensive responsibilities of these private firm actors. But unless you actually understand the kind of structure within which the firms are operating, then it's not really clear that the firms are going to kind of live up to these responsibilities, right? And I guess that's the kind of frustration I have with these papers that say like the carbon majors should do this or they should do that, they should be leading the decarbonisation struggle or something like that. It's that given the way that they're kind of set up and oriented to pursue profit and to kind of avoid risky investments, then it's not clear to me that they're going to act on those responsibilities. Does that make sense? So it's kind of trying to like step back from that and think about what might be causing them to not act in a responsible fashion.
Thank you.
Yeah, great, thanks. I really enjoyed this as well. So my question is about the relationship between the two claims that you're making and whether the second claim might undercut the first claim in a little way. So the idea I take it with the first claim is that by engaging in these actions, the carbon majors express contempt or disrespect. But in the second part of the paper, you're kind of explaining why they're kind of incentivized to take these actions in the first place. So if you take those incentives seriously, then it looks like the costs of not undertaking those actions are quite high for people who are carbon majors, because you know they face competitive pressures and so on. And so if they don't engage in these kinds of activities, then they face certain kinds of costs. We might think that those costs aren't, you know, all things considered, high enough for us to still think that they're not expressing disrespect, but it seems to kind of weaken the basis for our moral judgment that they're expressing disrespect in the first place. So there's a kind of a line in Marx which makes a similar point, which is that you know, under capitalism, the capitalist is just as unfree as the labourer, right? Precisely because they're within this broader sort of structure which sets incentives for them to act in certain kinds of ways. So I kind of wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah, no, I love that Marx quote, and I think that was like definitely in the back of my mind when I was writing this. So I guess like in a sense, I kind of agree with you that it undercuts the first one, because that's kind of what I'm saying, is that it's insufficient just to stop there, because once you kind of factor in this other step, it's set of institutional rules, then it weakens the case for just kind of blaming individual actors for doing bad, wrong things. And actually, like the issue that we need to be focusing on more is that institutional setup. Yeah, so I guess like maybe just for some context, like the original kind of starting point of this paper, like when I initially submitted the abstract, was thinking about the justifiability of public ownership of fossil fuel companies. That's kind of like one of the demands of the climate activists. And I've kind of ended up not getting all the way to justifying that claim, but this is kind of like part of that. So the idea is then that once we kind of stop just pointing the finger at individual actors and individually irresponsible acts, then we might have to think more about these kind of large scale, like structural changes and changes in ownership. But yeah, thanks. I need to think more about that Marx quote.
We have one more question in the room.
Yeah, thanks so much for the paper. I was wondering about so your second claim about the profit maximization sort of being a central issue. And I was wondering if it's like the act of trying to maximize profit itself, or is it the fact that the system doesn't take into account externalities? So like there's a big, I think, movement within the climate literature to like put a price on ecological services so that like the system could still maximize profit, but do so in a way that is not going to cause the sort of ecological crisis or contribute to it. And I was wondering what you thought about that, or like in what ways does that not go far enough? Yeah, I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really helpful question. So, yeah, basically, I don't. My kind of moral and political intuition is that it doesn't go far enough, and I want to see these kind of changes in ownership, like public ownership, democratic public ownership. But the reason why I've kind of made the slightly more modest claim in this paper is because I haven't been able to find a way to justify that move. That basically, like, I guess the problem I face is that I want to kind of justify that, but I'm not sure what it is about the democratic public ownership what that can solve that the factoring and externalities thing can't. And that's kind of where I want to get to, but I just kind of sidelining it for the purposes of this presentation. And so basically what I'm saying is there's two questions. There's a question of like why these acts might be wrong. And then there's also the question of what we should do about it. And what we should do about it, I'm kind of leaving open for like potentially the factor and externalities thing is an appropriate answer to everything I'm saying, potentially. But I just haven't answered that in this paper.
Okay, Pierre?
Yes. So, Charlie, do you have a question?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, thanks for the paper. I'm very sympathetic to a lot of it, but I maybe want to ask a question in a similar sort of vein to what Jamie did, and maybe like ask where it might seem a little bit murky whether this is a clear-cut case of disrespect or contempt in the way that these act, right? So it might seem that if your story about contemptuous action is that an agent or a collective acts in a way that doesn't appropriately take into account the basic interests of another person, for instance, there might be these kind of quite difficult cases in non-ideal circumstances where the basic interests that people have conflict at the bar of carbon consumption and production, right? So it might be that given the way that our energy infrastructure currently is, that we need to meet our energy demands through consuming a certain amount of carbon, right? Through these kind of carbon major services. And that might defend the basic interests of people to having a house that has heating, for instance, or being able to exercise some kind of fair value of freedom of association, or even just, you know, in developing parts of the world, it might just be them having like a kind of basic level of subsistence, for instance, or something like that. And it seems to me that in all these cases, the consumption of carbon, whilst it does have this kind of deleterious effect on the environment, can also protect and encourage the defense of other basic interests. And once we see this into account, there might be some cases where it's not so obvious that the extraction of coal and the production of sort of those kinds of services do create or do resemble the kind of contemptuous acts that you're describing them to be. Like I say, I'm very sympathetic to the broad tone of the paper, but I think that there are these difficult kinds of cases where different basic interests will come into conflict at the bar of fossil fuel extraction and consumption. And I just wonder whether you have any resources to adjudicate those sort of difficult cases within the paper.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm just trying to look because I thought I had maybe a quote in my notes that I didn't end up reading out that maybe relates to this, but I can't find it now. But yeah, so I think like up to a point, that's right. Then I guess as soon as the kind of what you also have to factor in is the way that these firms are obstructing the pursuit of alternative means of meeting those basic needs that you're talking about, right? So if there's a clear-cut case of the only way to protect certain moral interests was to continue extracting fossil fuels, then I think maybe it would be like like you say, like a complex case, like not a clear-cut case. But given that the firms have played like an active role, like historically and up to the present, in kind of preventing alternative means of meeting those basic interests from kind of coming to fruition and gaining prominence, then I think you have to kind of return back to this idea that, in a sense, that makes it more contemptuous because there's an available, feasible alternative that they're kind of trying to criticize and like prevent from like replacing their own. So like the actions of the carbon majors in that way kind of go right back. Like they've always kind of tried to spread misinformation about like clean energy and like the inability of carbon like neutral forms of meeting basic needs from like being suitable. I'm not sure if that really answered your question, but that was kind of my first thought in response.
Could I just could I have a very, very quick follow-up if we have time?
Yes, quickly, please.
Yeah, so the only follow-up would be, so I think on the lobbying we can agree, it seems quite clear that there is some kind of contempt there, right? That it doesn't seem to provide any big social benefit or defend a basic interest as such. But in terms of the extraction, a lot of the energy infrastructure that we currently have is kind of legacy infrastructure that relies on the burning of fossil fuels to turn turbines to meet our energy requirements and so on. And so just again, riff off kind of Jamie's point, is that if we do in your paper have this view that there are these kind of structural responsibilities, disincentives and things, then it seems like the fundamental responsibility relies on states to provide different kinds of energy infrastructure, such as nuclear or stuff that doesn't run on fossil fuels, right, and doesn't have this effect. And it seems maybe more difficult to establish the contemptuousness of the fossil fuel extraction itself, given these kind of non-ideal energy infrastructure institutions that we have. It's my only point, but again, I'm very sympathetic and I really enjoy the paper.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful.
So, Carl, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. It's actually related to the previous question, and it's maybe not put in as eloquent a way, but I'm also very sympathetic to the point, and I like your two theses and your two claims, and I think that the second one is very promising. The worry that I would see, and I'm wondering how you would respond to this, is that it kind of introduces a discursive element into it. So part of what makes actions disrespectful is the context in which they are carried out. So for instance, if we think about a court jester, he can be completely disrespectful about the monarch, but because of the context in which he's carrying out these actions, these are permissible and they're not considered disrespectful. If we transfer this now to the context of the carbon majors, maybe if they provide some sort of context where they say, oh yeah, we completely understand and respect the concerns about the environment, but this is necessary, they can continue their extractive activities whilst pretending or whilst showing some sort of respect to the people they harm, but in the line of what Charlie has been saying, that because this is necessary, that it's not really disrespectful, or something like that.
So can I ask my question, because it is linked with Carl's. So I ask my question. And then you can respond to two of them. So as it had been said, I think your core interrogation is linked to what economics call externalities. I don't know if you agree with that first. If so, do you think that the externalities are a moral or economical problem? The problem of contemptuous acts is that they impose a non-consensual harm or cost to others, or that they are, or is the problem is that they impose a cost, non-consensual cost to the others, or that they are immoral relation to the others. Consequently, the solution to this problem, is it to force the one who pollutes to pay for the cost of cleaning the planet, which economists call internalization of the externalities, or is it to forbid these contemptuous acts because they are absolutely immoral, destructing activities? And if so, this should result of that destruction of economic activity, which can be useful for human being, which Carl says that there can be considered as necessary. So that is my question. So do you think that it's a good level to question the problem of what you call contemptuous acts on a moral level, or it's better to question, to address this point on economical level?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I love that point about the court jester, and I quite like the idea of incorporating that into my paper in some way. The only trouble I can spot with it is that, like, with the court jester example, it seems like the kind of, it's basically like the way that is justified, or the way it works, is because like a certain benefit or good, like entertainment or like frivolity, is kind of delivered through violating the like duty of respect, and that kind of, in that situation, that constrained situation, is seen as like outweighing the violation. So it's kind of like, it's more beneficial, like all things considered, that there's this brief violation. I just don't think that the kind of the weighing thing works in the same way with the carbon majors, because the harms and the costs kind of seem to dramatically outweigh the benefits. Like, it is true that, you know, current societies are reliant on fossil fuel extraction in a whole host of ways. Like, one example that often gets mentioned is how like medical equipment relies on plastic, and plastic is kind of like a fossil fuel thing. So it's not just that we're like how you run your car, but it's like this whole infrastructure in society. I just need to think more about how I would do that kind of accounting in my mind. And I really appreciate the question, because I think that maybe I present too one-sided a case, and I think maybe that's part of what's leading to a lot of these questions. Yeah, in terms of the externalities, yeah, that's a good point. I'm like kind of suspicious of this language, because I think part of the reason we're in the situation we are is because of these kind of like dominant economic norms and these dominant economic ways of accounting for things. The basic kind of idea that I started out with, and it's not in this paper anymore, but the basic idea is that, like, forms of democratic public ownership, they enable firms to pursue like a wider range of objectives. So it might be able to engage in like a rapid decarbonisation of fossil infrastructure at the same time as kind of retraining and retooling workers to work in green energy things. And there's lots of other examples. Maybe they could also be rewilding the fossil fuel infrastructure at the same time. And I guess that's where the idea of a public ownership kind of comes in. It's because it's this pursuit of a range of objectives at the same time, rather than this narrow pursuit on profit. And again, I'm not able to substantiate here, but my kind of intuition is that that's a more desirable way of accounting for things than just kind of trying to put a price on the externalities that are involved. But like I say, I wish I had a better argument to kind of substantiate that. And yeah, thanks for pressing on it, because I definitely need to think about it more.
Thank you very, very much for your attention and the quality of the conversation. It's perhaps now time to have lunch. Eric, do you agree with that? So don't unconnect. We will resume our work at 1:30. So see you.
Yeah, just a last reminder, please do not disconnect. You can keep the session open, that's easier, so we don't have to admit you again in the lobby. Otherwise, we will admit you again, but if you can stay connected, it's easier. So thanks.